Okay, welcome back. In the next series of videos, we're going to do away with all the beginner stuff that we already covered. Since this training, this tutorial, this whole product is centered around the idea of production workflows and techniques to use in production, our main focus is going to be on just that. So we're not going to be going over any beginner stuff. We're not going to be going slow, and we're definitely not going to be covering every little nook and cranny of a parameter or a little slider in a PPG, stuff like that, unless it's really, really, really important. For the most part, we're going to be moving pretty quickly, and we're going to be covering techniques and workflows to use in production when deadlines are tight and when high quality renders are required. So to get started, we're going to open up an example scene. So hit Control O to open up the scene browser here, and the scene we're going to load up is called Dungeon Start. Ooh, dungeon. That sounds very interesting. And here we go, we're loading up. Alright, so here's our dungeon scene. So this is a scene that was created specifically for this tutorial, and as you can see, it's, well, a dungeon. It looks like a medieval dungeon. It has very dark, dirty, gritty texturing to it. It's got some little details here like chains and shackles, things like that. We have a little well over here that probably collects some dirty water for our poor prisoners, whoever may be unfortunate enough to be locked up in this place. Okay, so we got this hole in the roof with some iron bars. We've also got this window here in this back wall with some iron bars. Then we have this large window with more iron bars. And of course, every dungeon needs its very big uh, dungeon door here that you can't really break out of. Okay, and then we have this sort of water tank here in the middle, and I don't know what the prisoners use this for. Maybe the prison guards or something come in here and do some water torturing, or who knows what they do to prisoners in this strange medieval dungeon. And then we have a hallway that kind of leads that way and pretty much leads nowhere, just to a wall and some more bars. So too bad for the prisoner that spent years chipping away at this wall, making a hole large enough to escape, just to find that there's a dead end on the other side of this hallway. Very bad sense of humor there by the prison guards, or whoever built this prison. Okay, so next thing I'm going to do is create a preview render, and I can do that by going to the main toolbar and hitting preview right here. And we have our preview render here that's rendering out, as you can see. Okay, so our render just is coming out fairly quick, but it could be faster. And right now the size is just too big. It's coming out at the default, which is 720 by 46. So let's close that. Before we can start setting up any lighting for the scene and getting to rendering with Mental Ray, we need to set up a more friendly, preview-friendly approach or settings to preview render. Since we're going to be preview rendering over and over and over again very constantly throughout this entire project, we're going to need to be able to preview render as fast as possible because we can lose a lot of time preview rendering. Unfortunately, preview rendering is necessary because we can't render in real time. We have to go ahead and render with Mental Ray, which is going to force us to preview render all the time to make sure that our lights look good, or else there's no way of telling how our lighting's coming out. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the render menu over here and open up the render manager. Just expand this out a little bit like so. Okay. Now by default we're set to this preset here for the render size. So what I'm going to do is turn on the override scene render options there, and then in the drop down I'm going to go down to the custom format. Now you can see that I can adjust the width and the height of the actual render in terms of pixels. Also, lock aspect ratio is turned on. You want to make sure you leave that on, and I'm going to show you why in a moment. If I switch this from 720 to say 400, you'll notice that the height also switched automatically from 486 to 270. That's because I have the lock aspect ratio turned on. This is good because it's going to mean that it's going to create a smaller render which renders out faster. If I go over here to the rendering tab under the Mental Ray options over here, I can see that my anti-aliasing is set too high for previewing. -1 is the minimum and the max is 1. So I'm going to knock the max down to 0 and the minimum down to -2. There was a phone ringing in the background, so we're going to edit that out of the video, edit this out of the video. Starting again in 3, 2, 1. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and lower the max level to 0 and the minimum level to -2 and close the render manager. Now if I do a preview render, you notice that the render is a lot faster and it's smaller too. So the quality is less and its size is smaller, so it renders much faster than before, which is what we want. You also notice that I'm doing preview renders without hitting the preview button. That's because I've mapped a custom button to my keyboard as opposed to having to come over and hit preview. By default, the preview button is not mapped to any hotkey on the keyboard, so I went ahead and did that myself just so I can go faster. Alright, so now that we got that done, we can see then preview render. We got a very nasty render. Right now we're working with the default lighting in XSI. As you remember from a previous video, XSI creates default lighting for you every time you start a new scene. That's the exact same lighting we're using in this scene, the default lighting. And if you remember, default lighting is comprised of two things, a default light and default ambience. So let's go over here to the ambience and let's turn the ambience off. Now let's open up the Explorer and take this default light that XSI created and delete it. And now if I do a preview render, you notice that I get a pitch black scene. This is not good, right? Well, no, it's actually perfect. That's exactly what I want. Basically, I just wiped my work table clean so I can start from scratch. So I'm going to create my own lighting system here totally from scratch, so I don't have anything affecting my scene except the lights that I create and I put into the scene myself, which is exactly what I want. So now that we did that and we're ready to start setting up our lighting, let's go ahead and start to set up our lighting. Now, I'm not going to lie to you, our lighting system here, our own custom light rig, is going to be pretty complex. So we're going to go ahead and spread this over several videos. And in this video, I'm just going to do some of the basic lighting first, and then in the next video, we'll just pick up where I left off. So next thing to do is to create the first part of the lighting system. The first part I'm going to create is the sky shader. Mental Ray has its own physical sky shading system that we can use to create an actual environment of a sky and a sunlight that we can use. So let's go ahead and put that in. To do that, in the Render Main toolbar, we'll go down under Pass, we'll go to Edit, and we'll go down to Initialize Sky Shader. So we'll open that up. And XSI wants to know a couple of things. First thing is, what render pass would you like to apply the sky shader to? Since we only have one render pass, the default pass, we'll leave that alone. The second thing XSI wants to know is, what light would you like to use as the actual sun? So, the sunlight can be either a light that's already in the scene, which is not our case because we deleted the only light in our scene, or XSI can create a brand new light for us and set that up for us automatically. So that's what we'll do. We'll just hit apply. And now if you notice, or maybe you won't, or maybe you will, down here is this brand new light that XSI created and placed in our scene. And I'm going to grab it and I'm just going to move it. And you can see my light here. And the light is constrained to the center of the grid, and the grid is hidden right now. So if I come over here and turn on the grid again, maybe go to wireframe mode so you can see this better, there's the center of the grid. The light is always going to aim and orient itself to look at that center of the grid, as you can see when I move this light around. The sunlight is an infinite light as well. It's another thing to make a note of. Okay, if I open up that sunlight's PPG, you'll notice that it has some default parameters, 0.75 for the light intensity, and it has no shadows enabled with an umbra of 0.75. Let's close that. As I said, everywhere we move this light, it's going to aim to the center of the grid. Now the light is going to control the way that the sky shader looks. The sky shader is actually in our background right now. If I create a render, a preview render here, we can see that there's a sky now in our background. That's coming from the Mental Ray physical sky shader. Okay. Now to control the way that the sky looks and its intensity and how bright it is or how dark it is, we actually move this light around. So if we move this light and put it right over the head of our scene, right over the top, almost like the way that a sun is right above you, or seems to be right above you when you're outside at daytime during at about noon, okay, we can see that the sky shader becomes brighter and more brightly lit. This is because the sky shader is trying to basically change the time of day based upon the angle of the sun. So wherever the sun is in the sky is going to determine what time of day this shader appears to have when we render out. So that's another thing to make a note of there. What I want to do is create a sort of sunset, sort of sunrise feel to this. I don't want it to be midday. So I'm going to go ahead and take this light and I'm going to place it at about, let's see, in the Y, maybe about 22, 23, and maybe negative 55 or 56 in the Z. And I'm looking right here in the MCP. You can see here in the X, Y, and Z. That's what I'm looking at, and that's where I'm making my changes. So as long as it's something like this is actually pretty good. I think I'm going to leave it at that. So go ahead and place it at about 23 and negative 56. This is going to work out just fine. So just for the sake of using clean numbers, although I'm really not saving a lot of time by doing that, but I am being a little bit more precise. So there's my sun. And if I come inside my dungeon here, and I do a preview render, I can see the sunlight is affecting my scene, but something just doesn't look right. Can you guess what it is? Well, if you guessed shadows, then you guessed right. The reason this doesn't look right is because we have no shadows. This sunlight should be projecting shadows instead of just going through the wall like some kind of magic sunlight. So let's open this PPG, activate shadows, and turn the Umbra all the way off. Now let's come back into our scene here. Let's do a preview render here. Now we can see the sunlight is coming in and it's hitting our dirty, nasty water here, as well as our little water tank right there, and creating some shadows. Well, that's great and all, but this render still doesn't look very good. Well, we've basically just touched the tip of the iceberg in terms of lighting for the scene. Like I said, we're going to have a pretty complex lighting setup coming up. So the sunlight isn't doing exactly a very good job of lighting up our scene. That's because it needs some help. We can't just expect the sunlight and the sky shader to do all of the lighting work for us. It's not that easy. So what we need to do is use something to supplement it. Now, one of the best supplements, or one of the best features of Mental Ray to use in combination with the physical sky shader, is indirect illumination by way of final gathering. Works fantastic. So let's go ahead and let's go to render, and let's open up the renderer options here. I didn't open the render manager simply because it's too big, and right now I really only need to affect these options here. So I'll go to final gathering. You'll notice that it's turned off. So let's click on enable here, check mark it on, and whoa, we get a lot of options here. Okay, so by default it sets us up for multi-frame and 100 rays. So if I render from out here, I do a preview render, you notice that it says creating final gather points, and it calculates that and then renders out the actual final image. You also notice that there's this faint indirect illumination going on right here on the sides of the building, and it'll probably be a little more evident if I move my light right over the top like this, so it's kind of like a midday. Now there'll be more indirect illumination, and you can see it clearly right there. See the back of the building and the sides? Now they're getting kind of this bluish tone to them because the sky is so bright and blue, so we're getting this nice indirect illumination, which is great. So I'm just going to hit undo once to put that light back into its previous position, back to this sunset type of look to our sky shader. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go inside my dungeon here, and I'm going to create another preview render. Now if you're expecting this to be brightly lit, I'm sorry, but you're going to be sadly mistaken. A couple of things happen. Number one, the room is still as dark as it was before, so final gathering is having virtually no effect inside the room. Why is that happening? I'll explain that in a moment. You also notice the other thing that happened was that final gathering isn't going so fast anymore. Now it's going very, very slow. That's because final gathering is view dependent. What that means is that final gathering is going to render slower or faster depending on what your camera's looking at. When we were outside, like this, from far away, we're not looking at a lot of detail. All the detailed objects like this little water well, the water tank, the door, all this stuff is on the inside. So we can't see it from this camera view angle over here. All we see is the outside of walls, which are pretty simple. A wall here, ceiling here, wall here, so on and so forth. So it's easier and faster for Final Gather to calculate. Also, we're a little bit farther away from the building, so it's even faster and easier for Final Gather to calculate there as well. When we're inside the building, we're up close, and we're looking at more detailed objects, so our Final Gathering algorithm is going to slow down to try to calculate that more complex setup. You also notice that like I said before, the render came out very dark and black. Basically, the Final Gathering had no effect. Now the reason for that is because Final Gathering just can't do everything by itself. You can't just turn on Final Gathering, hit render, go take a coffee break, come back, and have a beautiful photorealistic render or have some nice indirect illumination. It just doesn't work that simple. You have to really create your own custom light setup. And Final Gathering isn't there to create your lighting for you. It's there almost to supplement your lighting. It's there to create your indirect illumination. So what you need to do is, instead of focusing so much on Final Gathering, focus on the direct lighting in your light rig. Focus on the direct lighting. Make sure your direct lighting is top notch. If your direct lighting is really, really good, then your Final Gathering will help that direct lighting look even better. But if your Final Gathering is good, but your direct lighting is bad, your Final Gathering isn't going to look that good. So just keep that in mind as a little sort of unwritten rule about rendering in production. Let me go back here to the Final Gather rendering settings. I'm going to switch from multi-frame to automatic mode. Just less options for me to have to tweak. And I'm going to switch the number of rays from 100 to 32 because 100 is just taking way too long to render. And right now, I'm in a phase where I have to do preview renders, and my boss is going to come in at any moment and hit me in the head with a baseball bat if I don't hurry up and get this done by the client's deadline. So I have to do everything in my power, everything I can, to make sure that these preview renders go by as fast as possible because I got to get this light rig done like yesterday. Okay, so there's the Final Gathering. It's calculating. It's going a lot faster than before, but it's still going kind of slow, so I might even have to knock down the Final Gathering more, but I'm really not going to worry about that right now. As you can see, it still comes out very, very, very dark. So I'm going to close that window to cancel out the render. It's still too dark. Again, that's because I don't have any direct lighting set up except for this sunlight, which isn't really doing much to help the situation anyway. Okay, so now that I have my initial lighting set up, let me go back to my render options. I'm going to turn off Final Gathering. Again, like I said before, I want to set up a really, really good direct lighting rig. And then I'll worry about indirect illumination by way of Final Gathering. So Final Gathering will come at the end, and we'll use that sort of as icing on the cake, so to speak. And we're going to focus on our direct lighting rig to make sure that that light setup is really good, top notch, and ready to go. Okay, so this video's gone on for a little while, and what I'm going to do is, since we already got the good starting point here, we have the sky shader set up, we have our sunlight in our scene. The next thing we're going to do is I'm going to stop this video, and in the next video I'm going to start to set up my direct lighting rig. I'm just going to get into it and start creating my lights that I need to get this thing rendering really good. Okay, so I'll end this video here, and I'll see you in the next one.